Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be out here, Jesse. Trying to get the slides started here. When Jesse first called me about coming out and speaking, I jumped at the chance. I thought, wow, this will be a good chance to get out to western Nebraska again. It's been a while since I've been out here like everybody else. And it'll give me a little bit of chance to explore a topic that I hadn't really looked into much in terms of the value of water out here in the Panhandle. But after I got to thinking about it a little bit, I got a little squeamish. And the reason is, I grew up in the extreme southeast part of the state, in Richardson County, for anybody who's been down here near Humboldt. We don't have anything irrigation at all down there, so you have a dry land kid that's coming out here to extreme western Nebraska trying to talk to you about the value of water. So that caused me a little squeamishness. Secondly, as Jesse mentioned, I used to be in our government relations. I used to handle lobbying, so I've worked a lot of water issues from the lobbying standpoint, from the legal standpoint. And lobbyists, we don't get a lot of credit. People don't think very highly of us. You know, they think of smoky rooms with cigars. And I have a friend that has a lobbyist that has a bumper sticker that says, "Please don't tell my mom I'm a lobbyist. She thinks I'm a piano player at a whorehouse." So I hope you'll deal with me a little bit here. And when I started looking into this topic and started thinking about it, in western Nebraska and the Panhandle here, you are so unique in a lot of regards, and I think I'm just going to touch on that a little bit in what I'm going to say today. And I guess my goal today is to try to get you, rather than, I'm going to throw some numbers at you. I'm an economist. I got to throw some numbers at you. But my goal today is just to get you thinking about what the world would be like out here absent water from an economic standpoint. And I got to give Jesse a little bit of grief. Scheduling an economist on Monday morning, first thing up in a conference. I don't know, Jesse. That's it. So, all right, let's see if we can get this to work here. Hey, here we go. I see State Senator Steve Erdman sitting out there. Good morning, Senator. Good morning. His son used to represent this district in the legislature. And I went in last week when I was thinking about this presentation and what to say. I said, you represented this area, you grew up out here. If somebody asked you the value of water in western Nebraska, what would you say? What do you think I should hit on? And he just gave me one word, and it was invaluable. And I think in the end, I hope I convince you that that's the case out here, that without water in this part of the state, it would be vastly different, and water is invaluable. So what I want to try to do real quick this morning, I'm going to give a quick overview of irrigation in Nebraska. I'm going to talk a little bit about the value of water, and then the economic impact of irrigation from a statewide standpoint, and that's going to be pretty quick. I want to try to do that to lay the context of the importance to the Panhandle. And then I'm going to talk a little more specifically about the Panhandle. So this is the kind of two data points on the number of irrigated acres in the state of Nebraska. You heard in the slide presentation, we are the largest irrigated state in the nation. The orange line comes from the Nebraska Department of Revenue. It's their database on the number of irrigated acres, or the land that pays taxes based on the irrigated value basis. The blue line is from the USDA and the National Agricultural Statistics Service. You can see they track each other pretty well until about late 2010s or 2007, 2010. And the Department of Revenue then went up. I'm not sure why that is. I wonder if it's because of some of the land retirement programs we have in place, because someone will have to correct me, but I think they're still taxed as irrigated ground. And so when a farmer reports on the surveys, they're probably thinking, well, I'm not irrigating that right now, so that's not irrigated. So that might be the reason for the difference. But you can see we have somewhere between 8.5 to 9 million, a little over 9 million acres of irrigated ground. This is just to give you context in the Panhandle, and when I'm talking Panhandle today, I'm talking from this line up further west. And you can see this is the density of irrigation wells. This comes from the Conservation Survey Division. You can see in this part of the state, the density is most closely aligned with rivers. And you can see, I think this is Lodgepole Creek here and Pumpkin Creek. And we have some in Fox Butte, and then up with the Mirage Flats project. John mentioned the interaction between ground and surface water here, and that's unique out here in the state, and that's critical to how things operate out here. Does anybody have a good map of surface water projects in this state. I looked all over. Okay, Aaron, I'll have to hit you up. I tried to find one, and it's tough, but I threw this in there because it makes the point again. These are the Bureau of Rec projects in the state of Nebraska, and you can see the irrigated acres here in this part of the state, and then the Mirage Flats project up there. Now there's a number of private projects in this part of the state too that aren't on this map, but I just showed it to give you the sense of, if you know where the irrigation wells were, or the same place where the surface water projects are. And I'll let somebody else talk about that later, why that is. But that's critical out in this part of the state. So, water and infrastructure, we start trying to think of the value of it. And I want to apologize up front because there's a lot of things when you talk water that you can talk about value. Obviously there's irrigation, but there's domestic and recreation, wildlife habitat, power generation, groundwater recharge. There's all kinds of things that you could wander off into when you think about the value of water. And I don't want to discount any of these other uses, but I'm an ag economist. I work for a farm organization, so irrigation is what we think about when we think about water. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. But I just want to put this caveat in there that there are a lot of things out there that are valued when it comes to talking water, and but I'm not going to touch on them today. So in agriculture, as I thought about this and tried to put together, particularly out in the Panhandle, the value of water for irrigation, I kind of thought of three different levels here. First, obviously is the farmer and their use of water and the value that they derive from that. And one point I guess I want to make, I think a lot of us when we think about the value of water, we think about the static figure that's there that, oh, for farmers, water is worth $150 an acre or something. But that is not the case. It's like a lot of different things. It's very variable. It changes from year to year. It's very dependent on each farmer's situation. So it depends on the price of crops, what they're growing, the inputs that they're putting on, the cost of those inputs, the net irrigation requirement, how much water they have to put on, how much expense they have in that, soil types, irrigation type, crop mix, you name it. There are a lot of variables in there. So as I talk a little bit more about the value of water this morning, it's kind of think about it as a snapshot in time. And I'm not saying that from here all into eternity, this is what it is. It's variable and changing. The other thing to think about is the suppliers, or what economists we like to think of as backward linkages. These are the people that are supplying the materials, the inputs, the products that are necessary to put that crop into the ground. So it's your co-ops, your seed dealers, your equipment dealers, all those. Those are called backward linkages. Those are the purchases and expenditures. Irrigation is a more intensive agriculture than dry land. You're purchasing more inputs. So there's an economic impact from that. You're purchasing more seeds, you're purchasing your power generation, or for irrigation. There's all kinds of things that go into that more than dry land. And so that. And then, when I thought about it here, and I'm going to make this point a little more in a bit, but the processing side of things, oftentimes when we talk about economics, we leave it, or the economic impact, we leave it with the farmers and then the suppliers into the farmer. But this time, because of the uniqueness out here, I thought a little bit about the processing sector, because you have Great Western Sugar here, you have the dry bean facilities, and I'm going to make the argument that without water, that you likely wouldn't have those facilities out here and the jobs that generate and the economic impact that they generate. So here's a lot of numbers. I warned you that there would be some numbers. Nebraska Farm Bureau over the years, there have been a handful of studies done to look at the economic impact of the state of irrigation. And some of them were done by the University of Nebraska Bureau of Business Research a few years back. Charles Lanphier, if anybody remembers that name, and Roy Frederick from the Department of Ag Economics. We asked a firm out of Iowa a few years back in 2017, would you look at irrigation in Nebraska and kind of in a typical year, what it means for the economic impact. So I want you to ignore all these top 3 numbers in each column. I just want you to focus on the very bottom numbers. And we have 4 different categories: employment, labor income, value added, and output. And think about that. I'm a baseball fan, and so I watch a lot of baseball. When a batter comes up to bat, they throw out all these statistics about measuring the batter's effectiveness. You have batting average, home runs, on-base percentage, slugging percentage. Those are all just different ways of measuring a batter's effectiveness. These are the same way. It's just different ways of measuring economic impact and economic effectiveness, if you will. So what they did is they looked at our 3 major crops in the state: corn, soybeans, and wheat. And they're trying to compare the world with irrigation to world without irrigation. So they pretended that we didn't have the ability to irrigate. And they used 5-year averages of prices and yields and UNL crop budgets to look at the inputs into it. And they just looked at the backward linkages. They didn't look at the processors and the like. And so on a typical year, so to speak, and total output measures the total receipts of business receipts or revenue of that. And this includes, I should say, this was done using an input-output model. So it took multipliers. It took not only the impacts on the farmers themselves, but then how it spilled out through the economy, through those purchases and expenditures they made. And so the total output each year that irrigation contributes is about $3.3 billion to our economy. In terms of value added, that's kind of like a gross domestic product. That's the value that's added by the industry is $1.2 billion, close to 8,000 jobs. Now that's just kind of again, a snapshot, a measurement of a typical year. So you can see that in each and every year, irrigation in the state of Nebraska contributes economically, which you're probably thinking, no duh. But that gives you a little bit of a measurement of that. So they can go a little further and say, okay, who are most impacted by irrigation? What economic sectors are most affected by irrigation in the state? Now, obviously, the top 2 would be grain and oilseed farming, right? Farmers would be are most affected by that. But then you can scroll down here and you see wholesale trade, real estate. If you didn't have much irrigation, you wouldn't have much land transferring, and that would affect. Support activities, farm machinery, truck transportation, owner-occupied dwellings, homes, and you think about that. So the inputs into farming, the farmers aren't buying as much inputs, the co-ops don't hire as many people, or the input suppliers don't hire as many people, there's not as many houses that are needed. So you can see how that kind of spills out. You have monetary authorities or banks, so it all kind of starts to spill out through the economy. The other thing we asked them, this was actually done before the study I just showed you, and that's what got us thinking about doing that other study. But this one, we asked them, obviously, remember 2012, and the drought we had. And we watched all the other major corn producing states in the region drying up and losing their crop. But fortunately, because of Nebraska and our irrigation, we didn't. I mean, our dryland farmers suffered big time. But if you had irrigation, you were able to come out. It cost you a lot more, but you were able to come out of it okay in terms of the crop produced. And so we asked them, okay, look at it in a year of drought, and at the end of 2012, they put this report together for us. It's very similar. It uses an output model. It's measuring the expenditures that farmers in their irrigation. It's not looking at the processing side, just the goods going, the inputs going into the farming sector. The same kind of measurements, but this is what it said. A couple numbers that astounded me was the employment. In a year of drought, if we didn't have irrigation in the state of Nebraska, we would have 31,000 less jobs, is what that means, basically. So in a drought year, irrigation in the state is contributing 31,000 jobs to the state of Nebraska. And you can see the total output figure jumps up to near 11 million for that. And there's a difference, or the reason for that big a difference is, if you think about a drought year, the difference between irrigated yields and dryland yields are going to be a lot more significant. So that's going to be captured. In 2012, because of the drought and what was happening, we saw corn and soybean prices skyrocket, if you remember. So that was captured in that as well. But so you can see that Every year, irrigation contributes to the state, but particularly in drought years, it's a major contributor to our economy. So now I want to take a little bit look at the Panhandle, excuse me. And I just put this, the average precipitation in here is 15 inches. You probably don't realize that, but this is the driest part of the state. So in terms of the irrigation requirement that's needed to grow a crop, it's a lot higher out here than it is in other parts of the state. Total irrigated acres in those 11 counties that I west of that line was about 730,000 acres. And to put that in context, that's somewhere between 8 to 10% of the total irrigated acres in the state. Again, it's a surface and groundwater system. In fact, I think I saw something, and John or Dennis or somebody can correct me, but I think I saw where surface water acres outnumber groundwater acres in this part of the region. So it's very much a symbiotic relationship out here. And the thing that also that's a little different here than in other regions of the state is the downstream users, and I put up Lake McConaughey just as an example, the reliance on return flows from this region to feed that lake, which then in turn is used for hydropower and for irrigation further downstream. So there are some spillover effects, I guess, if you will, from irrigation in this part of the state, not only economically, but otherwise. You probably can't see this very well, but this is to get at the average precipitation and the net irrigation requirements. So that's the amount of water that's needed to fully water a crop on top of the irrigation. So you can see in Scottsbluff County, you probably can't see this, it's 14 inches is what it says. So all up and down here, it's about a little over 14 inches. And then on this part of the state, where I'm from, it's 5.5 inches. So that just goes, I think, critically to show you how important irrigation is to this part of the state in terms of producing a crop. So we look a little closer at the irrigated acres in this part of the world. There are 3 counties that jump out. The one that we're in right here, Scottsbluff County, has almost 171,000 irrigated acres. And the percentage, if you can see that below it, is the percent of crop irrigated as a percentage of total crop acres in that county. So in Scottsbluff County, 94% of the crop acres in this county are irrigated. And the other couple counties that jump out are Box Butte and Morrill. They have Box Butte 138,000 and Morrill County 122 about. But still, 70% in Morrill County is irrigated of the crop acres, 57% in Box Butte County. And you can see as you get out further away from the North Platte River, those percentages start going down. And there's not as much irrigation, because they don't have access to the water once you get further away. And so when you're talking about the impact to this part of the region, it's the 3 counties, Box Butte, Morrill, and Scottsbluff. The other thing I did is I thought, okay, let's look at the major crops produced in these counties, and let's look at what I call the density, the irrigation density. That is, how much of that crop is produced under irrigation versus how much isn't. And some things really stand out here. So sugar beets, obviously a big crop out here. In those 3 counties, 100% of those sugar beet acres are irrigated. Corn, anywhere from 70% to 94% of the ground is irrigated. So a little bit of dry land production there, but not much. Dry beans, over 91 to 98%. Again, very heavily irrigated. Forage, which is your hays and your grasses and things, not quite so much, and then wheat that falls off quite a bit. But those are the largest crops produced in this region, and it can give you an idea of how much irrigation is needed for those crops. So when you start thinking about the value to farmers, one of the first things we'll do as economists, we'll look at land values. Because you think in an efficient market, the farmers knowing, having the information, they should be able to factor in the yields and the differences in the cost and come up with some kind of a value when they buy that land that they think is a difference. So you can see this is from the Department of Revenue, and this shows their assessed values on irrigated and dryland crops. And I realized on the way out, I probably should have converted those. Their assessed values are 75% of market value. And I didn't convert them to market value, I just left them at 75%, and I think I probably should have converted them. But you can see there's quite a difference between irrigated and dryland values in the region. And on average, across all those counties, at market value, it's about $2,000 per acre. So that's a farmer thinking, I'm buying this land, I'm thinking about the increased returns I'm going to see out of irrigation over the next 30, 40, 50 years, however much I'm going to own that land, and discounting it back and saying, I think it's worth about $2,000 an acre. So that's one way to kind of put a value on it from a farmer perspective on the economic side. This is cash rents. This comes from the USDA. You can see we don't have quite the number of data points there, but again, you can see quite a difference between irrigated ground and dryland ground. On average, and this is at market, at average it was about 120, I think $25, $30 an acre. So that's a farmer, if you want to go rent ground for a year, say for that year, it's worth, having the water is worth about $125 to $130 an acre to me. So I want to go through a bit of an exercise with you. I want you to think like an economist with me and think about how we would go about trying to measure the value then. And what we have to do is we know what the world looks like. We know what irrigation and agriculture and the communities look like with irrigation. That's the current world we live in. But we don't know what it would look like without irrigation. So in order to determine the value of how much that irrigation is worth, we've got to think about what would things look like without water, and you got to make some assumptions. Now economists get a lot of grief about making assumptions, right? You always hear the jokes about economists and assumptions. There was one joke about, there was a physicist, a chemist, and an economist on a deserted island, and a can of beans washed up, and they're trying to figure out how to open this can of beans. The chemist says, well, let's just put it in salt water and we'll break it down and we'll open it up. The physicist said, well, let's put it in the water, cool it down, put it back out on the beach, heat it up, and the constant expansion and contraction will pop open that can of beans. The economist says, well, let's just assume we have a can opener. So, my little job, or my little levity there, see if you're awake. But, so what we got to do is think about what the world would look like without irrigation. So, as I went through this exercise in my mind, I was thinking, okay, one thing, there's going to be fewer farms here in the region, just because dryland farming couldn't support the number of farmers that we have. Secondly, there's going to be vastly different uses. I pointed out that sugar beets are 100% irrigated, dry beans are almost 100% irrigated, corn is pretty strongly irrigated. Likely, as you won't see those without water. Instead, you'll have wheat, sunflowers, millet, other dryland kind of crops that you can raise on short water. You're likely going to see more or less crop ground and more grass pasture ground to the extent that it's there. Less infrastructure, less co-ops, less suppliers, no irrigation districts, and I would argue because of the extent of the irrigation for sugar beets and dry beans, you wouldn't have the sugar beet processing industry and you wouldn't have the dry bean industry here in the region. So as you think about then what are the ramifications of that, fewer jobs, smaller communities, less people out here, and then I'll point that not only would lack of irrigation affect that, but obviously some of the other uses, recreational interests, you would have Lake Minnetonka, some of those kind of things. I think they're less political representation because the census just came out with their population estimates, and they're already talking about the potential of losing 2 legislative districts in rural Nebraska and moving them into Omaha and Lincoln because of the population changes. So I just threw that in there. The other thing to think about is the tax implications. And I ran a couple quick numbers in Scottsbluff and Morrill County. If you didn't have any irrigated ground and you converted it to dry land, you would be losing in Scottsbluff 10% of your value base, or roughly taxes about $5.7 million, and in Morrill County 18% of your tax base. Now that's assuming that it all converted to dry land and that the local governments were about the same size. But that's some pretty big assumptions, I think. So the canal collapse was mentioned earlier, and I think it provides a glimpse of what the world might be like, or at least peek inside the door of what it might be like. And there was a study done, and one of the authors is at the back of the room, Jessica Grosstock was part of this. It was done by the University of Nebraska in Wyoming, and they tried to come up with some estimates of what the economic impacts of that would be. Now, there's a little bit of difference because that failure occurred mid-season, so you already have the inputs, the seeds put in the ground, the fertilizer and the like, so you wouldn't have the complete impact. But they estimated that without that water for the rest of the season, there was nearly 250 jobs in the region. This is just Scottsbluff County. 250 jobs and almost $53 million in total receipts. Again, that's not only to the farmers, but that's to the general economy in the region, taking into account those backward linkages. And so that gave a little bit of a glimpse of the value in that regard. And so I wanted to carry on a little exercise with myself based on the assumption that without the water, you wouldn't have sugar beet production in the region. And if no sugar beet production, you wouldn't have the sugar beet processing. You wouldn't have the facility here when you enter town. So I looked at both the farming, and this is just Scottsbluff County again, just the farming and the processing together. And according to the in-plan model, which is an input-output model that a lot of economists use to kind of look at these kind of things, they were combined together. They're responsible for about 256 jobs and about $158 million in total output in Scottsbluff County. So that would include Morrill County or some of the other counties that raise sugar beets. So then if you go through this exercise, say, okay, what if we didn't have sugar beet production in this county? What would that mean? And so now we're trying to account for those linkages backwards into the suppliers that are supplying into both sugar beet farming and sugar beet processing in the region. And you can see the number of jobs almost doubles that they're responsible for, 553 jobs, and the output jumps up to 210 million. So you can sit there and think about, okay, that's what those industries are contributing to the economy today. If they weren't there, that's the impact, potential impact to the community of not having sugar beet production or processing in Scottsbluff County. So it's nearly double the number of jobs and a substantial jump in the loss of receipts and revenues. And in terms of how that filters down through the economy, this is on the output. These are the sectors that are most impacted by output. I didn't include the sugar beet processing or the sugar beet farming. Obviously, they would be impacted, but you see trucks, natural gas, wholesale grocery, insurance, financial. So that gives you a little bit of an inkling of which industries are most reliant on irrigation for sugar beets in the county. And then this is just the number of jobs that could be impacted by that. And again, by sector. I thought it was interesting that restaurants jumps up here towards the top. So a lot of those trucks hauling sugar beets will stop at the restaurants or something. So anyway, you can see just a little bit of the importance of the irrigation in terms of the processing sector in the county. So close up this morning, how to grasp or get a handle, get your arms around the value of water out here. And I go back to invaluable because I think it says it best. Probably in no part of the state is the local economy, the local region so reliant, particularly in Box Butte, Scottsbluff, and Morrill counties, on having that irrigation and that water available. The Panhandle would be vastly different in so many ways, and you could carry this mind exercise out for quite a while and think about all the various impacts of it. As you're traveling around, for those of you going on the tour, maybe a way to think about the value is look at the areas that are not irrigated and the types of ag that are going on there right now, because that provides a picture of what the kinds of production that would occur if you didn't have water. So I think that's a good contrast to look at it. And then I don't want to lose sight of this fact from an economic standpoint. there would be, I just looked at kind of Scottsbluff County and then kind of the Panhandle counties. But obviously there were spillover effects out to greater Nebraska and Wyoming and area regions. And I think particularly because of the downstream uses that are reliant on some of the systems up here, I think the effects, in my mind, would probably be a little greater than you normally would. And I don't want to lose sight of that fact as well, too, because I think this region plays a key role in some of the uses that are occurred in the rest of the state. So I'm going to quit with that, and I'm going to just a plug here. I put out a weekly newsletter, electronic. It goes out every week on Mondays. It touches on topics like this, like the economic value of irrigation, all kinds of things happening around farming and ranching and economics. If you have any interest at all, there's my email address. Shoot me an email, and it's free of charge. Everybody can get it, and we'll add you to the list. And you could, if this trips your trigger at all. So, but do we want questions? Or? Okay. Jesse says we have time for questions, and I'll take any question except from Gary Hovert sitting over there. Questions?
I'm not an economist, so I'm asking what percentage of those crops make up the total? For example, sugar beets, how great a crop is that in this area?
45,000 acres of sugar beets in the entire state, and the bulk of them in Scottsbluff, Morrill counties. Boxview.
So it's the number one crop?
No.
Okay.
So alfalfa is actually the number one crop. Sorry, I'm sorry, Jane.
Go right ahead. She lives and works out here, so she knows this stuff a lot better than me.
Yeah, so alfalfa is actually the number one produced crop. If we go into like actual field crops, corn would be next, then dry beans, then sugar beets. You have to remember sugar beets are quantity restricted. So not every person can go and plant sugar beets. It's a cooperative that controls the quantity of acres that are planted on an annual basis.
Is alfalfa pretty water intensive too?
Gary Stone.
To answer your question, yes, it is. They'll probably average 28 inches per year, 3 to 4 cuttings out here. That's what they get. My neighbor's third cuttings now. I know he's going to rake it today. It'll probably be baled by tomorrow.
It's going to rain between now.
Yeah, so they're pretty good. So yeah, it is.
Hey, Jessica, a question for you. When you were talking about those are the number of acres planted, what in terms of market value? Are sugar beets a little higher in that regard? Or?
So sugar beets are really, thank you. So sugar beets are really interesting. The way the cooperative is set up, and John, are you guys going? Do you have someone from Western Sugar on the tour?
Unfortunately not. We were going to go to that.
Okay. They're gonna start early harvest here pretty quick, so they're really busy right now. But the way that sugar works is the federal government controls how much sugar is produced in the United States. And so that does a few things. So we have a quota system, if you remember quota systems back in the day. So basically we can only produce so much sugar. And so as we look at these cooperatives, they work with the federal government to determine how much sugar we can produce in the United States. And so our farmers buy shares, and those shares equal 1 acre of crop that they can plant. And so they did that in the early 2000s. Now, the federal government then therefore controls the price of sugar. So it's a really interesting concept. So we don't actually know exactly what the price of sugar is because of how the federal government works in terms of what their contracts are. So it's a completely controlled system of what happens within the industry. So they also made a change recently where they no longer pay for the tons of the actual beet, they pay for the pounds of sugar actually produced. So you'll see within our industry that we're actually going to a smaller beet that has a higher percentage of sugar. Prior to that, it used to be get as many tons off that ground as possible. Now it's get as much sugar off that ground as possible, which is very, very different and a very different approach to how they think about what happens with that sugar. But we could tell you what it costs. Now, whether or not they make a profit is a question.
Where does Nebraska rank in the amount of sugar beets that are grown?
I'm not sure. You have to remember, it's not just sugar beets, it's also sugar cane. So we're also restricted by that. There's also some interesting things that play into GMOs, because sugar beets are a GMO crop, sugar cane is not. So Hershey, when they want to put their non-GMO butterfly on that, will not take Western sugar. So there's some interesting implications into that, but when you add in sugar cane, I'm not sure in terms of total sugar production, where we fall within the states. Jay, do you know?
Yeah, I don't know, because obviously you got California and Hawaii on the sugarcane side. I think in sugar beets, I know Minnesota has some production, I think North Dakota has some production, and does Idaho have a little bit too? So I think we're right up in there in that mix with those 3 or 4 states in terms of sugar beet production. Yep. Other questions?
And Jay, though, so letting Hawaii's on see it, California, Hawaii, so the company, Maui closed. So I think it's the mostly Louisiana, Florida, Southeast side,
Okay. Chittaranjan was just saying in terms of sugar cane, California, Louisiana.
C&H says California.
Oh, C&H California, okay, that company, so, yeah. Other questions?
Have you gone through the process of quantifying the economic impacts of groundwater recharge?
No, that would be a fascinating, and as I thought about this, there's so many different things that could spin off of this and look at this. But particularly in this region, groundwater recharge, and all of the things that come out of that, it would be interesting to look at the economic impact of that. But no, I haven't. I don't know, Jeff, has there been anything done in your district on that? Yeah.
I know that it's significant.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen a number.
Right. So, and particularly in a state like Nebraska, where we have a number of regions where there's a strong hydrological connection between ground and surface water, that's an important element of it.
We've still got some time if there's another question.
Can I add to the groundwater recharge?
Sure.
I want to make you run today.
Government Fitbit.
Yeah.
So the question regarding groundwater recharge is extremely, extremely interesting, because as we talk about the evolution of irrigation in this region, we have to think about the fact that these farms were not necessarily built for center pivots. And so there's some really interesting things that happen as we look at them. So if you look at the topography of the valley, the farms aren't square. Okay, we're not eastern Nebraska. So when we think about that, then we've got these kind of odd-shaped corners, and we still have to run the gated pipe over those. But as we add more center pivots, which increase efficiency in terms of water use, it decreases the amount of groundwater recharge. And so it's always interesting to be the economist here. And Jay and I kind of had a chuckle about it earlier. But our inefficiency is also our efficiency when it comes to groundwater recharge. And a lot of our farms are reliant on both. So for example, my husband and I farm in the county, and we have both center pivots as well as groundwater. We actually still set siphon tubes if you ever want to see that. And you're welcome to come see it anytime. But we have to have both in order for our system to continue. So that's something that we're constantly talking about is, yes, you're more efficient in terms of water use, but you're losing the water running over that surface. And it's not just the water in the fields, it's the amount of water released from Wyoming and Colorado. So I think Dennis is going to talk about surface water management, but there's also considerations to actually how much water we release down the systems and how much is seeped out of those canals throughout the entire system. So it really is an interesting dynamic, and it's very important that we have both types of water because these farms were built for a surface water system. And now we're looking at groundwater recharge as well. So just something interesting to consider as you walk through our fields.
Maybe just a comment, Jay. It's scary to note that this valley without sugar beet. Scary to know the future community socioeconomic status, but probably what about role of non-traditional crops, for example, yellow field beans, millet, or some other high-value crops which are not traditional, but moving forward as this is inevitable, the water will be more and more scarce, it will be more challenging. Still, we need to keep the community living. People cannot just run away from here. Maybe we need to introduce more industry, new industry. For example, if I just think about yellow field pea, what is the total market of pea protein in today's world? And what's the projection? So considering that, and compared to corn, sugar beet, dry beet, soybean, pea water requirement is comparatively less, significantly low. Can we complement pea in a circle? Maybe we put 50% of the circle with yellow field pea, really high value yellow field pea, assured protein level as well as quality to feed that market and generate comparable revenue like sugar beet or corn or dry beet. That's my thought.
So that is an excellent point because as you think about not having access to water, farmers and ranchers and agriculture and everybody are pretty ingenious in looking at ways to maximize their potential in terms of receipts and production and economic value and economic impact. And so I would guess that there would be, I think there would be some of that. And it's just a matter of how you set up, again, making assumptions and set up your scenarios. But I would think that's what makes this kind of an exercise so difficult, because if you didn't have water in this valley, obviously there'd be other kinds of industries and other kinds of production and other kinds of things that would spring out of that, and it'd be different. But how much so, and the kinds of economic impact, that's kind of difficult. But I do think, particularly in this region, as we're seeing the consumers, more and more consumers are looking at non-meat proteins, the field peas and some of those crops, I think, could come into the mix out here and be a viable alternative in some of the cropping mixes. So I expect to see some more of that in the future. But I think that's an excellent comment, and you're right on. Yes?
I want to contribute a little bit to the discussion about the sugar beets. The percentage of sugar beets in the valley from studying these crops for the last 15 years is somewhere between 5 and 10% of the total Panhandle crops. So I think the woman up there asked what percentage of the crops were of sugar beets. So it's actually fairly low in regards to total sugar beets. Somebody else back there was talking about irrigation recharge, and I want to kind of give more of a comment on that. As very important and a significant piece of it is actually canal recharge, so the loss out of the bottom of the canal is actually 60 to 80% of our water, groundwater in the valley. So you can argue that irrigation loss is very important, but canal loss is even more important, especially out of Pathfinder Irrigation District that Dennis is going to talk about. They provide most of the groundwater in our entire district, and in Nebraska and Wyoming, from that one canal company. And so irrigation loss is a thing, and it is important, but I think canal loss is even more important. So lining canals, things like that, reducing that water loss becomes a bigger impact than change of flood to pit.
No, that's exactly right. And thank you on that on the sugar beets. As another one of those things, I was thinking about driving out here. I should have looked a little bit at the percent in the mix. So I just kind of went off the top of my head there on the sugar beets, going weeds and the like. So.